My name is Emily Norton, and I'm one of the OFC, sorry, it says here I'm one of the OFC chairman. I'm not, I am the OFC chairperson for 2023. I cannot wait to welcome you to Oxford in January. Now, a bit of housekeeping first. We are all very familiar with Zoom, but just a brief reminder, if you could keep your microphones on mute, unless you are speaking, of course, unless you're invited to the stage. And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat function. The guys who are presenting today from Virgin Money will pick them up and will ask those questions. This session is being recorded, so if you have missed any of the sessions today, it will be available via the Oxford Farming Conference website after the event, and that will be emailed to you shortly. So without further ado, the Phil Fringe programme today and the conference running from the 4th to 6th of January would not be possible without our partners and sponsors. So our thanks go to all of them, and in particular, our headline sponsor, Trinity Natural Capital Group. But without further ado, I won't keep you any longer. Our next Fringe of the day is hosted by Virgin Money. So guys, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily. And thank you to the Oxford Farming Conference team and the wider sponsors for putting on this Fringe session today. I'm Simon Haley. I'm one of the directors at Carbon Metrics. We're an independent consultancy firm helping farmers to both collect, interpret and act on some of the recommendations from collecting data for a carbon audit and a carbon management plan to help them on that journey to that net zero position. And I'm going to be co-hosting this session this afternoon with Brian Richardson, who is the head of agriculture at Virgin Money. So Brian, over to yourself to give some context to our session and to let the attendees know what we're in for the next 40-45 minutes.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for that, Simon and Emily. The theme of this session is net zero farming, threat or opportunity for the sector, and I think incredibly important for us all at the moment in terms of net zero and in terms of the challenge around global warming. We all know about that. I suppose from my point of view, I started with a bank almost 5 years ago, and the Oxford Farming Conference in 2019, Minette Batters then very much committed agriculture in England to net zero by 2019. Shortly after that, at the NFU conference, Michael Gove, who was Secretary of State at DEFRA then, talked about a revolution coming in farming, both in terms of new policy post-Brexit, but also around this net zero agenda and the focus that the sector needed to put on that. So from a bank point of view, why is it important to a bank? I think obviously it's important to everyone. I think in agriculture, we get very focused on where we are in terms of the agricultural challenges we have. But from Virgin Money's point of view, and I think all the banks, it's very much working with our customers, and that's across all the sectors. But agriculture has a particular focus, I think, around net zero. It's not only contributing 10% of greenhouse gases, if you look at the numbers, but it's also potentially a big part of the solution for wider industry and wider society in England. So very much important to us to be working with our customers. There's an incredible focus there from the regulators and the Bank of England in terms of them looking very much long-term. What are we doing with our customers to ensure we're supporting them on that journey? We're making sure they're in a position to be able to travel and move forward. And as a financial institution that has a lot of touch points with customers, we're able to support them on that journey towards net zero. So that's very important. And I think as some of you will know, the wider investment community is very focused on ESG and sustainability and that net zero goal. We've recently published our annual accounts as a bank and lots of numbers in there, but there's an equally sizable document that goes alongside that, talking about our climate and what we're doing about that in terms of our sustainability, not only as a bank, so our own business, but also with our customers. And I think the whole net zero agenda becomes part of that viability of business and potential risks for those who ignore it and do nothing. So again, when we're often lending money out for 10, 15 and 20 years, so agriculture is a long-term business and we need to do that, we need to understand how our customers are going to deal with some of these challenges around net zero, etc. And I think importantly, alongside that, it's very much the right thing to do. We know the challenges of climate change. We see, and particularly in agriculture, we feel the effects of climate events. So we know it's the right thing to do. Farmers are very much custodians of that environmental and the countryside, and we need to manage that. So what have we been doing as a bank? We produced an agricultural net zero report at the beginning of last year with the help of Simon and his team. So that's very much what I would describe as a practical document for farmers to be able to read, give them an understanding of what we mean by net zero, some of the challenges around that, and some of the basic measurements. So we'll go through more of that as we talk. And then towards the end of this year, we've launched our Agri-E Fund. That's a £200 million fund, again, providing incentivised finance for farmers to be able to invest specifically at reducing carbon and on that journey. So net zero, incredibly important to us. You know, there is the challenge around government is using Bank of England regulators to push us in the direction, but as I say, it's the right thing to do. So Simon, back over to you, and you can perhaps look at some of the other push-pulls are coming from in terms of this net zero debate.
Yeah, so let's just zoom out a little bit before we zoom back in again into the detail down for agriculture. Well, sorry, I think we've got some background noise going on. So
Simon's gone quiet now.
Oh no, I was muted. I'm back. Can't keep me down. So the wider political agenda, obviously, I'm pretty sure everyone would recognise that net zero is a big thing across government at the moment. We've had various strategy reports, and it's not just specific to DEFRA, whether it's led by BEIS, which is the Business Energy Industrial Strategy team, whether it's the local communities or the new Levelling Up department, or just across any of those different departments and agendas. And then on a worldwide basis, obviously last year hosting the COP conference, and then obviously recently we've had the COP27 conference. There is a lot of political pressure that is being placed on this net zero agenda. And despite all of those changes in leadership that we've seen over the past few months, certainly the UK government and DEFRA also are very much still committed to that agenda, driven or kind of being guided along by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and that Climate Change Committee, the UK's independent body in this respect. And this is where we've got this commitment to reach net zero by 2050 arise from. When we then dive down a little bit further into it, we then see that other parts of the industry and subsectors and certain organisations have then made even stronger commitments to get to that net zero target. So whether it's the NFU, who've put a target of 2040 on this, or whether it's other supply chain organisations who've said 2035 or 2030, or whether we anticipate people are going to be bringing this target ever closer to us, we know this is something that is a driving force across the activities within our industry. And these 4 priorities that I've taken from a DEFRA document that was published last year just kind of set the tone and give more of a flavour of how much that's there at the forefront of their mind when they're designing new policy, when they're releasing schemes, when they're doing reviews, and when that filters down, whether we could foresee that being a new standard on the sustainable farming incentive, whether that could be part of the new countryside stewardship enhanced element, whether there are other cross-sector grants or schemes that are being run at a local level or certainly cross-departmental level in government. DEFRA has a contribution in government to reach those net zero targets, and we've got to be savvy enough in terms of advising our farmers and also those who are running farms and rural businesses across the industry, that at the heart of it, it means you need to get on that journey as well. So in terms of saying, net zero, is this a threat or an opportunity to the sector? We need to be wise enough to think that we could sit on our hands, but at some point, the incentivized elements to get involved on this net zero journey might become more penalties down the line for completely ignoring it. When we go into some of the other elements, we've talked about bank, we've talked about maybe government pressure. What about some of those industry pressures, if we can use that term? Well, some of those have been around for a few years. You know, carbon auditing is not a new thing in the dairy sector in particular. But then whether it is beef and sheep, whether it is poultry, whether it is dairy, or whether it is across any of those different sectors within our industry, we can start seeing, and not just in the past couple of months, dating back to the start of the year and across all of last year, we can start seeing certain incentives that are being led straight from the supply chain themselves. So whether that is rewarding production efficiencies, which is something that Arla has come out with a statement that they want to target that by rewarding, I think it is 0.03 cents per litre, and they would be setting targets internally about how they would expect their dairy farmers to get to that point, or whether it is across, as I say, more industry-led, that we know what the baselines are, we know what the averages are for different sectors. It's something that farmers are going to have to recognise. You know, they're at the foot of that chain in a certain context, and they need to be careful that others don't expect them to provide the net zero position for other parts of the supply chain. We need to be savvy enough to protect it for ourselves. What do we mean though when we're talking about carbon auditing, carbon management? What does that break down to? And in effect, we're talking about three main greenhouse gases. And you can see on the screen there that I've put down the bottom. If we're taking carbon dioxide as a baseline measurement for this greenhouse gas reporting, just the context of how much methane and nitrous oxide are on a global warming potential comparison in terms of their significance to carbon dioxide. So methane has 28 times more global warming potential. Nitrous oxide is up at 265. Now, this is based on the GWP comparison, which was accepted at the Paris Agreement and is a globally recognized standard to be reporting against. However, there are other calculations that do exist. There's one called GWP star, and that actually looks at certain elements of those greenhouse gases in different ways. And we need to be careful when we look at the science that whilst it might look more favourable in one context, and it might show a particular sector in a better light, it might also throw a light on aspects of methane, for example, which more traditionally has a 20-year lifespan, where we would see significant effects from those emissions, which then kind of drops off and reverts back into carbon dioxide, whereas we're measuring this over a 100-year period. So obviously, when we look at the science, we really need to understand how we're kind of communicating it to make sure that agriculture is still seen in a positive light as contributing to some of the outputs of how we can address climate change within the sector and across the country, rather than getting too carried away otherwise. But we can pick up some of that in the questions as well. I'm happy to come back to that point. And before I pass back to Brian, again, just kind of wanted to highlight the importance of soils when we're talking about the conversation around carbon, which then obviously develops into conversations around natural capital. When we're looking at soils, I think it's important to understand the difference perhaps between carbon storage and carbon sequestration. So what we can see on the screen here is you've got your semicircle lighter green above ground, and then we've got our darker semicircle below ground. The darker semicircle below ground is showing the potential for carbon storage across each of these different types of atmospheres, whether it's temperate forest, temperate grasslands, wetlands. So whilst we can enable actions, and it's what we're talking about on this fringe about actions that you would take to be generally more efficient across your farm, will generally be good for your carbon footprint as well. Anything that happens in terms of the plant matter and above ground actions, we can see has a significant effect on carbon sequestration, but just look at how that pales in comparison when we're looking at the potential for carbon storage in the soils. And it's really important that people think about their soils and doing those soil tests and soil analysis as the starting point of that conversation when they're looking to get a baseline, collect data for a carbon audit, and then translate that forward into a management plan. We need to know that soils data in order to know what actions we're taking going forwards. But Brian, back to yourself about where some of those challenges might lie otherwise.
Yeah, just a reminder to those listening, if you do have any questions that come up from what myself and Simon are talking about, please do put them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end. But I think there's an awful lot of challenges going on in agriculture, and perhaps those challenges are building, particularly at the moment. But I think when we look at net zero, it is the overarching long-term challenge we do have in the sector in terms of being able to address that. And I think a lot of the other challenges we see, you can always put net zero as an umbrella across that. So we've got the new agricultural policy post-Brexit. We're going away from, effectively in England at least, universal payments where, associated with actually farming the land, to selective payments that need to be applied for. And by 2024, effectively 50% of those payments that have been earned since the 1970s effectively will have disappeared and be replaced. So the economics of farming is changing, and farmers are certainly having to put a lot of consideration into how much of those support payments they're going to look at going forward. There isn't more money in the pot at the moment. We've got until 2024 with the existing budget guaranteed. Who knows beyond then, and it's unlikely there'll be more money to be able to do that. So we're in quite a dynamic period of change, and that new policy coming out is very much focused on natural good environmental measures, but with the background there, as I say, of net zero. We've got an immediate challenge from agri-inflation and the change to economics of farming. We haven't seen, we've seen the ups and downs in things like fertilizer prices over the last 10 or 15 years, but we haven't seen anything like the 3 and 4 times multiplication of costs in fertilizer and others. And I think the latest Anderson survey is talking about 30% inflation in the sector. So we've got a potential squeeze on farming incomes, and at the same time, household budgets are squeezed. We're seeing changes in consumer demands. I was looking the other day, and we're still seeing this 6% tick down in red meat consumption. So demands are changing, and that's moving into proteins and obviously non-protein based meat as well. And that pace of change is quickening. So farming is changing quite quickly at the moment, and I think quicker than a lot of us involved in the industry perhaps realise. The government focus, I think, going back, as I say, I well remember in 2019, Michael Gove talking about a revolution, and I'm not entirely sure how many ministers we've had since then, but I think we're in a position now where we're going to be going up to the next election and really see some tweaking of that policy, but not an awful lot of change and focus coming through. No one's going to want to be particularly dynamic about it. So we're going to have to effectively focus on our own businesses during that time. And we've got to remember that farming's a long-term business that's traditionally been slow to change. So lots of challenges there, but we do need to come back to this focus of net zero. It's not going away. Climate change certainly isn't going away. And I think once we effectively get a new government, whichever colour that is coming in, then there'll be another focus on this going forward. So it's important, I think, agriculture and farming does what it can in the meantime to look after itself in terms of looking at that focus going forward. So plenty of challenge there. Simon, coming back to the net zero challenge, I'll let you pick up on that.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's very useful to be able to kind of just break down the terms, the carbon jargon, if we will. We have a document on our website where it's a downloadable PDF, which effectively is exactly what you can see on the screen. And I know for a lot of people that might be wary of engaging in conversation on this subject, or jumping into discussions, or feeling maybe that they think they know what people are talking about, but then potentially they're confusing terms around net zero or carbon neutral or natural capital. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think it's sometimes just useful to have a set definition or a phrase or some kind of clarification in your head that when we are talking around these terms, do people have that base level understanding? What is global warming potential, for example, or when we're talking about adding organic matter back into the soil, what do we mean by that? So look, these sessions are being recorded, and I'm more than happy to share on the slides as well, or point people in the direction of these. So just wanted to highlight some of those terms on the screen as well. How do we go about doing a carbon audit then? You know, there's a lot of hype, or there's a lot of chats about engaging with the process, but where do you start? What should you do? Well, the process of how we would take people through that carbon audit is on the screen there. So, you know, we've got the data collection process that would then be inputted into one of the carbon calculators. We would then, from that data that is then kind of generated and produced as a report, we would want to pull together some recommendations or some mitigation measures and advice as part of a carbon management plan, and then get back out on the farm, do that consultation, and be encouraging people to take actions that are good actions, as I say, for efficiency, where you can see that they're making a difference because either they're saving costs or generating better returns through improved yields or through improved management. But the bullet points I've put down the bottom, I really want to stress. And I'll come on to the differences in calculators in a second. And we use two as a matter of course to help sense check, because once you've got that baseline and you've got your starting position, you should really stay with the same calculator going forwards, and I'll explain why. But it's really important to measure and understand your data. I can't stress that enough. So whether or not you're thinking of diving in to do a carbon audit, if you have not yet done one to date, even if you don't do that for another 2-3 years, because for whatever reason you're not feeling pressure to do so, or it's not in your best interest to do so, at least I would encourage you to pick a date, let's say the 1st of January, 1st of Feb, whenever it is, and collect the data. So, you know, ask me for those data sheets. What are the types of questions that you would be needing to answer to be able to do that data collection process? And at least if you've done that at a point in time, you can come back to that 2, 3, 4 years down the line and do a carbon audit at that set date in time, rather than trying to remember backwards and trying to guess or estimate. I talked about the calculators then and the differences between them. I think it's really important taking a minute just to chat about that. If you typed into Google, how do I go about doing a carbon audit? Which calculators are out there? You would find about 67, 68 different calculators that you could legitimately use to start that process. However, we would say there's probably around 4, 5, 6, 7 specific ones that you might want to use if you're involved in agriculture. And that ranges from calculators called EggBase, which is very, very specific to the poultry and egg sector, or that could include any of the 4 that we've shown on screen as a bit of a highlight: Farm Carbon Toolkit, the Cool Farm Alliance and their Cool Farm tool. You've got AgriCalc, and then you've got the Trinity AgTech tool, which is called Sandy. But what I want to stress from this is that, in effect, being slightly facetious and blunt, they are all just products. They are all just products of different organisations, and it is an absolute fact that we could go through that process of collecting the data, and it might be the same data that we collect, and put it through each of those 4 tools on your screen, and you will always get a different result. So that could be one data set, but using a number of different tools, and none of them will show the same result. And that's really important, because some of them are specifically orientated more to enterprise specific data collection. Some are better suited on a whole farm basis. There would be 2 in the middle of the screen that we would recommend more so if you were in the dairy sector to use. As I say, if you're in the poultry sector, we would be pointing you down the route of egg base. And what's important to understand is, okay, they might align themselves to some of that reporting standards set by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or certainly more UK kind of data collection and reporting standards. But these are products of wider organisations that have interpreted the calculations through their own algorithms to present different results. Some include soil sequestration, some don't. As I say, some are specific to certain enterprises or sectors, and some aren't. So the fact that we sense check through too just shows you sometimes and highlights the discrepancy between the data as to where your starting point might be. And I know there are always then a million questions off the back of that about, well, aren't we then just picking the data to show what we want to show? And, you know, we'll revisit that towards the end of this presentation about why should you even start the process then of a carbon audit if there are tools saying different things, and it's a very valid question. But for us, it shouldn't stop you engaging in the process in the first place. So on to the next couple of slides, I just wanted to highlight then, when we are collecting the data and putting it through a calculator and then writing up that carbon management plan, what might be some of those actions that you could take to help improve performance? And as I say, normally actions that are good for your for a better carbon footprint will generally help with you being more viable on farm or being more efficient in the actions that you're taking. So for an example, for dairy farms, what might be some of the actions that we might be encouraging people to think about if they've not addressed so far, and whether that's around introducing herbal lays, whether that's around genomic testing, whether that's around low protein diets. These are more points of conversation to then have and share with other professionals involved with your business, whether it's the agronomist, whether it's nutritionist, whether it's your land agent, whether it's your bank manager, just to try and point you towards the fact of, the data at the moment says you're X% of the way along the journey to net zero. Is it actually achievable? If it is, what would you have to do about it? And maybe these are some of the actions that you could take to help in that respect. What about some other influencing factors then that we might be including in reports or pointing people down the direction of, to encourage them to think about different options and methods on farm? It could be around the use of on-farm renewables. And that's important just to say, because if you might have solar panels or turbines on farm, but if you're selling that and exporting that back to the grid, it doesn't have any influence on your carbon footprint on the farm. It might be around agroforestry. It might be around introducing biochar. And I can go into more detail on that if people aren't aware of what that is. But some of these are just starting points for conversation where we can easily do a sensitivity analysis and to show different scenario planning of how you might want to pursue some of these routes, and whether that's through the use of grant funding or just because it will help production efficiency. It's part of that carbon management plan, which is really important, rather than just using terms like improve housing and improve health, because that doesn't help anyone. A carbon audit should be a lot more than simply getting a bunch of numbers out the back of one of the calculators and trying to interpret it yourself. Brian, enough from me for a second. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Simon. We're obviously focus very much on this net zero agenda and carbon audits, etc. I think the big challenge, and where we perhaps started in this debate from over the last 2 or 3 years, has been really in terms of the economics of farming. Is this an either or scenario of either we produce feed or we become net zero? And I think as we've got more into this, and you'll pick up some of that from what Simon said from his technical presentation, I think it's more an understanding that this is about producing the same or even a bit more with less. It's about looking at the whole farm environment to deal with this. So it's not a choice of do we produce food or do we reduce carbon emissions. It's a joined up approach, I think, really. And we did a number of pilots with carbon metrics with our customers, and I think what very much came out of that was this deep dive into the business that a carbon audit provides. It really does give you a look at all aspects of your farm, what you're doing. So productivity improvements, are there benchmarking areas where perhaps productivity-wise you're not as doing as well as some others are doing, using the same inputs and the same resources. We've had several cases where people have actually stopped doing things because they realized they were probably unprofitable, but also they weren't able to do it particularly well, and they've started doing more of other things that they were doing things better. So I think that productivity improvement is a key area of this, being able to look at your business, where you're using these very expensive inputs that have suddenly become a lot more expensive. Can you use them more effectively? The little chart at the bottom, which is quite small, but that's the HDB have been doing some work over several years, really identifying that UK agriculture perhaps wasn't as productive as some of its near neighbours. And I think we can look at productivity without fear or favour, really, in terms of a focus for farms. And I think that is looking at all aspects of production. Where does regen farming fit into this? Some of this terminology that we're now looking at, doing things differently, as I say, still hopefully managing to produce the same amount of food, but actually producing it in a different way, looking at efficiencies and aligning with customers' requirements and expectations. I think we are seeing demand. We've got at least one of the supermarkets saying now they want to see the majority of their food going through their supermarkets, net zero by 2030, which isn't very far away. So there's the need on farm to be able to demonstrate this journey towards net zero for customers, but also I think that can be used in parallel with improving the productivity and efficiency of farms and moving that forward. And I think there is scope to be able to do that. So we've focused quite a bit on carbon audit. There's some cost involved in carbon audits, Simon. Is there some support to be able to get those done?
Absolutely. My favorite topic, Brian. I'm glad you asked. So absolutely, if you are paying for a carbon audit at the moment, I mean, obviously that's your choice, but there are other routes to market, because this is a hot topic, because it's a driving agenda, not just for DEFRA, but across industry and across government. There are various routes where you should be able to get a carbon audit funded at the moment, or certainly part of that anyway. And I've highlighted 3 on screen there, and then we'll talk about maybe some of the other routes for incentivization. So the one that opened in August 2021 and goes through to March 2024 is something called the Farming in Protected Landscapes scheme. This is very specifically for people who farm in an area of outstanding natural beauty or national park. It is part of that 15% of your BPS payment that has been transferred out of your bank account every year now and put into a separate pot of money, but with their 4 priorities around nature, climate, people and place. They are currently, or the majority of them are currently, offering 80% funding for a range of soil testing on farm and the collection and interpretation and production of a carbon audit and management plan. So that could be one route to market. If you are not part of an AONB or national park, from April 2023, we will have something called the Rural Prosperity Fund, which is also part of the wider Shared Prosperity Fund. And that might be important if you are in an area where your local council is heavily rurally populated, where they are setting a local priority that they want more sustainable businesses, or that they're there to produce actions and outputs from people across the region that will contribute to better societal health, a better environment, stronger well-being. That might be something not just with a diversification hat on that farming businesses are interested in, but align it to your local council's wider strategic plan. One that may be more close to home and is more universal to everyone across England is the scale-up phase of the Farming Resilience Fund that opened very recently and goes through to March 2025. There are 17 different consultancy organisations that are offering support down that route, and a number of them are putting focus on this net zero agenda and having the production of a carbon audit and management plan funded through that. Be careful though, you can only use one of those providers once your SBI is allocated against their contract, and you've got until March 2025 to take advantage of this. So if there's nothing immediately pressing, it might be that you might wish to wait to see how some of that landscape proceeds over the next few months in terms of changing policy about when you wish to take advantage of that free consultancy advice in that respect. And then other indirect routes to market where not necessarily this will be funded, but where you might wish to go out and have a carbon audit undertaken, whether you have to pay for that or not. I've put 4 different bullet points there. That could be more favourable lending criteria through reduced arrangement fees or preferential interest rates, such as Virgin Money's e-loan and e-fund. It could be around government incentivisation, whether that might be, for example, a carbon audit specific SFI standard over the next couple of years, or that having a carbon audit might enable you to jump from an intermediate to an advanced level within one of those standards. It could be around what I've referred to earlier, where performance efficiencies are rewarded direct from the supply chain, whether that is livestock or arable, or it could be around this private market innovation where we are going to see more incentivization around natural capital, whether that's actions to improve water or air or soil health, where potentially you could start stacking and bundling. And sorry, Emily, I've stolen your phrase there as you shared it from the Institute of Agricultural Management conference, where you could start stacking and bundling schemes on top of each other, whether it's a stewardship scheme, a FIPL scheme, a resilience fund scheme, etc., etc. But this is hot topic, and so there is funding out there to help you get on that journey. So Brian, just to kind of round off our presentation, I've seen a couple of questions that have appeared, so we've got some to answer before our session closes, but maybe just revisiting our title of, is this a threat or opportunity? Sum that up for us, please.
Yeah, and I think the other thing just to remember on that funding, bearing in mind, you know, we're in England at the moment where we're talking from, but in Scotland and Wales, there are the equivalent of those schemes to be able to plug into funding for a carbon audit. I think we started this talking about threat of an opportunity. There is plenty of threat around, you know, the ability to sell produce. I think, you know, we're moving into a stage where it's almost becoming like farm assurance. I think that you will need to be able to identify your carbon output to be able to produce or market your produce. That's a potential challenge. It's not here yet, but it's going to come, and we don't want 2-stage markets if we can help them there. Cost of that transition, as I say, I think we can build that in with efficiency. The choice of, do we produce food, do we produce or do we reduce carbon? I think there is a trade-off, or I don't particularly see a trade-off there. I think we can still produce this great high-quality food that UK agriculture produces, but there is a challenge there in terms of meeting that carbon, and a lot of work to do. Who owns the carbon benefit? Perhaps not one for this session, but it is making sure that farmers retain that benefit. Doing nothing, I think, is a big threat to individual farm units, because I think, frankly, you'll get left behind. And then the challenge as well around carbon reporting, and I think that there's quite a lot talked about that. I think it's less of an issue than perhaps it is. Nigel Davis there has pointed out just whilst there are different calculators and they come up with slightly different results, the theme is the same within those. But the opportunity there, as I say, in terms of being able to use a carbon audit, looking at business efficiency, potential from that for reduction in costs, and I think the amount of fertilizer that's being used in slightly different ways and perhaps more efficiently in the last 12 months identifies that perhaps there is scope for savings in the industry. massive opportunities from uptake of new technology, not just in new kit, but that's going to be important, but also I think in use of big data and farmers using the data they have. Pig industry has been doing it for a long time. Poultry industry has been doing it. I think there's a lot more chance to that. Access to markets, and perhaps the UK scene is leading the way in international markets. That potentially gives us more opportunities in the market, but it also perhaps gives us some protection that supermarkets don't go and suddenly buy eggs in Italy because they're a bit short, because they've made that commitment to net zero, and the English eggs have another marker on that puts them as a superior product. So again, protecting our market. And farmers taking the lead in the debate. I think that's incredibly important, that we actually own that debate. We don't wait for regulation to come down to tell us we've got to do something. And I think we're at that stage where we can take the debate forward. As I say, 2019, Minette Batters set that stall out in terms of net zero 2040. Let's see the industry move forward. And just finally, where do farmers go from here? If you click the slide on, Simon, I think it is about getting on the journey. A lot of farmers I talk to, I think, are saying, well, we'll wait and see. Carbon audits aren't quite everything there might be, so we'll wait a bit. I would get on that journey. I would learn the lingo. Simon put a slide up there with some of the talk we have. I think it is getting a bit convoluted and complicated, but actually doing a carbon audit, it helps you understand what it's all about, helps you understand what the relevance is in for your farm and the bigger picture, and gives you then time to plan and understand your options to gain from carbon. I've just put a couple down there. There's the woodland carbon code. If you're looking at trees, there's the peatland code. There'll be a soil code coming along soon. But all these different aspects, I think a carbon audit done in conjunction with a good consultant will start to lead you down that path and start to give you a chance. And I think it's also a chance now to look, as generally it is with the changes in support payments, etc., looking forward in your business and consider your future ambitions and requirements. Things are changing in a lot of areas in agriculture at the moment. So where do you want to be in 5 and 10 years' time? Is this the time to think about succession in your business because it's going to be different? Is this the time to make some investment, or is it the time to do something different? So I think it is a great chance now to really do that deep delve into your business alongside a carbon audit and just start to look forward. And as I say, our agricultural net zero reports out there. I think it is a good read. We'll be updating it in the next 12 months, and this thing's moving forward very quickly in terms of net zero and what we understand in terms of fertilizers and inputs and that side. So we will be updating it, but do take the chance to learn a bit more about it. Back to you, Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So just before I hand back to yourself, Emily, and the OFC team, we did have a couple of questions through that session. I think we kind of covered them in general, but Nigel and the other person who left the question, please do follow up direct with us if you want more of a detailed answer on that one. A closing comment from me, I would just very much encourage everyone. First job is to understand your baseline and look at how you can reduce those emissions within your own farming business. Then the second stage should be, now how might I offset? If I can't reduce any further, how might I offset, but within my own business? And then we can start talking about different land use types or actions maybe. And then the third step should be maybe then to look at offsetting outside of your farm business. But that, as Brian said around credits, is potentially a conversation for a different fringe session. So thank you everyone for joining this fringe and listening to myself and Brian take you through whether net zero is a threat or an opportunity for the sector, and the answer to that, hopefully you might be a little bit more informed about. But Emily, thank you very much, and back to yourself.
Brian, Simon, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. You've taken what is an unbelievably complicated topic, and really broken it down in very, very simple and straightforward ways that everybody can engage in. And I'm always struck by this thought that if you're not moving forwards, then you're actually going backwards, yeah, because the pace of change and what everyone else is doing, this is not something that we can kind of keep putting off. There is that bit about individual responsibility, stepping into this challenge of understanding what net zero means to us as farming businesses, and sort of engaging with the information. But you've set that out, all of that complexity, in such an engaging and simple way today. And so thank you so much. Like I say, this whole session is going to be, it's been recorded and it will be shared. So everybody can get the opportunity to listen into the expertise that you guys have shared. And thank you so much for being here to do that. It's been brilliant. So thank you so much to you guys and all the team at Virgin Money for that session. Now, to everyone else, the ethos of the Oxford Farming Conference is to inform, it is to challenge, and it isn't to inspire our delegates, giving you all views so you can make your own informed decisions on what's going on out there. Today, we've heard both the challenges and opportunities facing agriculture, and that's something we will continue to touch on in January, of course, under our theme, Farming a New Future. And we very much hope that you can join us there. You can find the link to buy a ticket. There are a few tickets still left. And of course, digital tickets will be available too. And that link is in the chat now. Our final fringe of the day, which I will be hosting again, is called Farming a New Future, from fundamental research to real world application. It's hosted by UKRI and it will start at 4:30 p.m. You will need to click on a different Zoom link, which you can now find in the chat, and it's been shared with you. And we very much look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again.